It was a cold December evening in Manhattan when Christopher Wright returned to his penthouse after a long day of meetings and court appearances. As one of New York's most successful corporate lawyers, his life was consumed by paperwork, high-profile clients, and the weight of always being one step ahead. The bustling city seemed distant from his quiet corner of the Upper East Side, where the streets were lined with luxury townhouses and the glow of holiday lights flickered in the windows. It should have been just another night, another moment of isolation after years of building his career at the expense of personal relationships. But that evening was different. The instant Christopher stepped out of his sleek black car, he noticed something unusual on the front steps of his townhouse. The doorman, usually swift in his duties, looked bewildered, hovering near the door. "Mr. Wright," the doorman called out, his voice carrying an unfamiliar tension. "There's something you need to see." Curious and slightly irritated, Christopher walked toward the entrance, his breath visible in the cold air. His eyes narrowed as he noticed a bundle on the doorstep, a large basket draped with a soft blanket. Instinctively, his heart quickened, an irrational fear washing over him as he stepped closer. "What is this?" Christopher muttered, crouching beside the basket. He pulled back the blanket, revealing what he least expected. 3 tiny faces staring back at him, squirming and cooing softly. Newborns. 3 of them. Christopher's mind raced. His pulse pounded in his ears as he looked from the infants to the doorman, his voice barely a whisper. "Who left them here?" "No one saw," the doorman stammered, clearly shaken. "I only found them a few minutes ago when I came out for a break. There's no note, no sign of who they belong to." Christopher stared at the babies, his mind struggling to process the scene in front of him. They looked so fragile, bundled up in the warmth of the blankets. Their tiny fingers grasped at nothing, their eyes barely open, unaware of the world they had just been abandoned in. Without another word, Christopher scooped up the basket, carrying it inside with a mix of disbelief and concern. The warmth of the house enveloped him, but his thoughts remained cold and fractured. He hadn't held a baby in years, hadn't even been close to the thought of children. His life had been about success, clients, and wealth, never about family. But now, 3 lives were placed in his hands, and he had no idea what to do. "Call the police," he instructed the doorman, his voice firmer now, though his mind was still clouded with questions. "We need to find out who these children belong to." The doorman nodded and quickly stepped away, leaving Christopher alone in the foyer with the basket of babies. As he looked at them, a sense of responsibility began to weigh heavily on him. Someone had left these children at his door for a reason, but why? And more importantly, why his door? His thoughts drifted back to Emma, the woman he had once loved deeply. She had vanished 10 years ago, leaving a gaping hole in his heart. He had tried everything to find her. Private investigators, calling mutual friends, scouring every place they had been together. But Emma was simply gone, without a trace. The mystery of her disappearance had haunted him for years, but eventually, he had forced himself to move on. Now, looking at these 3 innocent faces, he couldn't shake the creeping thought that this was somehow connected to her. The police arrived not long after, breaking the tense silence that had filled the house. Christopher watched as the officers examined the scene, asking routine questions he had no answers to. There was no note, no identifying marks, nothing that gave any hint as to where the babies had come from or who their parents were. "The hospital will run some checks," one of the officers explained. "We'll see if there's any record of newborns matching these descriptions." Christopher nodded, his eyes never leaving the infants. What happens to them now? The officer glanced at the babies before meeting Christopher's gaze. "Well, they'll be taken into care for now. It's the standard procedure until we can track down their parents or find a suitable foster home." The thought of sending the babies away, of letting them slip through the cracks of the system, gnawed at Christopher. He had grown up in a stable, privileged household, but he knew too well the stories of children lost in the foster care maze, never finding a true home. His mind wrestled with the absurdity of the situation. He was not a father, nor had he ever imagined becoming one. But something deep inside him resisted the idea of letting these children go. "No," he said suddenly, his voice surprising even himself. They stay here. I'll look after them." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "Mr. Wright, are you sure about that? It's a big responsibility, especially with 3 newborns. And we don't know how long." "I'm sure," Christopher interrupted, his voice steady, "at least until we find their parents." With that, the decision was made. As the officers left, Christopher stood alone in his vast, empty home, now suddenly filled with the soft cries of 3 tiny lives who had come to him by fate. He looked down at the babies, each one now sleeping peacefully in the makeshift cribs the officers had provided. His chest tightened as a strange but undeniable sense of purpose stirred within him. He didn't know why they had been left at his door, or who could have done it, but as he gazed at their sleeping faces, Christopher couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The first night after the babies were left at his door was nothing short of chaotic. Christopher, a man used to courtroom battles and high-stakes negotiations, found himself in the most unfamiliar territory of his life, changing diapers, mixing formula, and cradling 3 newborns through their relentless cries. He had barely slept. The hours blurred together as he stumbled through his townhouse, trying to keep the babies comfortable while simultaneously wrestling with the enormity of what had just happened. The next morning, as the sun rose over Manhattan, Christopher stood in the kitchen, staring at the small mountain of bottles scattered across the counter. He had never realized just how fragile life could be, or how utterly unprepared he was for the responsibilities of caring for not 1, but 3 infants. Yet, something inside him refused to give in to the overwhelming chaos. Despite the sleepless night, despite the noise, he felt an inexplicable attachment to the tiny beings now occupying his home. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from one of his colleagues, a reminder about a meeting later that afternoon. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the nearby crib where the babies lay, finally asleep. Work had always been his priority, his escape. But now, these children demanded something deeper, something he wasn't sure he had. Responsibility, care, love. He couldn't walk away from this, not after deciding to keep them under his roof. He ignored the message. Hours passed in a whirlwind of caretaking. By mid-afternoon, Christopher found himself sitting on the couch, a bottle in hand, feeding the smallest of the 3. She had soft curls of dark hair and the tiniest hands he'd ever seen. As he looked into her eyes, an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He had never pictured himself as a father. His life had been tailored for success, not family. Relationships were fleeting, mere footnotes in his otherwise meticulously planned existence. But now, staring into the wide, innocent eyes of the little girl in his arms, Christopher couldn't deny the overwhelming instinct to protect them. They were his responsibility now, at least until he figured out the truth. The phone rang again, snapping him out of his thoughts. He shifted the baby carefully to her crib before answering. "Mr. Wright," came the voice of a woman on the other end. "It was social services. We've reviewed the situation regarding the infants left at your doorstep. I understand you've decided to temporarily take care of them, but we'll need to conduct home visits and a formal evaluation before anything is finalized." "Of course," Christopher replied, keeping his tone measured. "I have no intention of making this permanent without understanding where they came from." "Understood," the woman replied. "We'll need to establish if there's any family out there looking for them. In the meantime, we'll send over some resources to help with their care." After the call ended, Christopher felt the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. He had agreed to take the children in, but the questions that plagued him remained unanswered. Where had they come from? Why were they abandoned on his doorstep? And, most troubling of all, was there a connection to Emma? As the day wore on, Christopher found himself pacing the halls of his townhouse, the sounds of the babies filling the air. His thoughts kept drifting back to Emma, their last conversation before she disappeared, the way she had looked at him, full of love and fear. It had been almost a decade since he had last seen her, but the memories were as vivid as ever. He remembered her soft laughter, the way she would lean into him during cold winter nights, how she always made him feel like the center of her world. And then, one day, she was just gone. No explanations, no goodbye, only a haunting silence that had never left him. He had searched, he had tried everything, but Emma had vanished without a trace, leaving only questions behind. Suddenly, a cry from one of the cribs interrupted his thoughts. Christopher rushed to the nursery, where little Oliver had started to squirm. He was the loudest of the three, always the first to make his presence known. Christopher lifted him gently, cradling him against his chest as he tried to soothe the baby's cries. As Oliver quieted down, Christopher glanced at the nearby windows, noticing a car parked outside, one that hadn't been there before. His heart skipped a beat, a sudden tension filling the room. He watched for a moment, waiting to see if someone would step out, if this could be the moment he finally got some answers. But after several minutes, nothing happened. The car remained parked, its windows tinted, offering no glimpse of the person inside. Unease crept over him as he laid Oliver back in the crib. Was it just a coincidence? Or had someone been watching the house, waiting for the right moment? The thought of being under surveillance made his skin crawl. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow connected to Emma's disappearance, or worse, to whoever had left the babies at his door. The next few days passed in much the same way. An endless cycle of feeding, changing, and caring for the babies, interspersed with moments of deep reflection and concern. Christopher's once orderly life had become a whirlwind of diapers and bottles. But more than that, it had become a mystery he was determined to solve. On the third evening, as he sat in the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the nursery monitor, the doorbell rang. Christopher's pulse quickened. Visitors weren't exactly frequent, especially now that his life had taken such an unexpected turn. He opened the door cautiously, half expecting it to be a neighbor with some trivial concern. Instead, a man stood before him, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. His expression was unreadable, and Christopher immediately felt the weight of something serious hanging in the air. "Mr. Wright?" the man asked, his voice smooth and calculated. "Yes," Christopher replied, his tone guarded. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes flickered toward the hallway behind Christopher, as if expecting to see something or someone. "I'm here regarding the children." Christopher's grip tightened on the door. "Who are you?" The man smiled, though there was no warmth behind it. "Let's just say I'm someone with an interest in making sure they're taken care of properly." The air between them seemed to freeze. Christopher's mind raced, searching for any hint as to who this man might be. But he knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary visit. "You need to leave," Christopher said, his voice low but firm. "Now." The man's smile never wavered, but there was a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "I'm afraid it's not that simple, Mr. Wright. You see, those children, they belong to someone." Christopher's stomach tightened. He slammed the door shut without another word, his heart pounding in his chest. Whoever that man was, he had no intention of letting him near the children. But the encounter left him shaken. As he stood there, the weight of it all pressing down on him, he realized that this was far from over. The mystery of the babies, Emma's disappearance, and now this stranger. Everything was connected. He could feel it in his bones. But no matter how dangerous things got, he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Christopher slammed the door and leaned against it, his mind racing. The man's words echoed ominously in his head. Those children, they belonged to someone. Who? And why had they been left with him? He had no time to process the confrontation. The monitor in the living room buzzed to life with the sound of a baby stirring. His breath was heavy, his heart still pounding, but he had no choice but to push the fear aside. He needed to focus on the babies. With trembling hands, Christopher picked up Oliver from the crib, his small face scrunched in discomfort. The warmth of the child in his arms brought him back to reality. He wasn't just dealing with a legal mystery or a puzzle. These were real, vulnerable lives depending on him. The rest of the night passed in a haze, but the man's threat lingered. By morning, Christopher knew he had to act. There was more at stake than just the baby's well-being. There was a dangerous undercurrent to all of this, one he hadn't yet fully grasped. But his mind couldn't shake one recurring thought. Emma. He had been haunted by her disappearance for years, but now, with the babies in his life, her memory resurfaced with a strange new urgency. It was impossible not to think about her. The way she vanished, with no explanation, leaving nothing but a trail of questions and heartache behind. Had Emma known something all those years ago? Was it possible she had some connection to these children? Christopher had to find out. He made up his mind to dig deeper into her disappearance, something he hadn't done in years after countless failed attempts. As the babies napped that afternoon, Christopher sat in his study, staring at the file he had kept on Emma all these years. It was slim, too slim. Private investigators had followed every lead, every potential sighting, but they had come up empty. There had been no sign of her since the day she vanished. Still, one photo remained on his desk, a faded memory he couldn't let go of. It was of them together, taken on a weekend trip upstate. She was laughing, her eyes crinkling in the sun as they stood near the edge of a lake. Back then, everything had seemed so simple. They had been happy, he had been happy, but something had been lurking beneath the surface, something he hadn't seen until it was too late. Just as his thoughts began to spiral, his phone rang, startling him. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant, Christopher picked up. "Mr. Wright?" a woman's voice asked, her tone professional but slightly hurried. "Yes, who is this?" he replied, his grip tightening on the phone. "This is Sarah Lane, from the Missing Persons Division. We're calling regarding Emma Hart." Christopher's heart skipped a beat. The mere mention of her name was like a jolt to his system. "Emma Hart?" he echoed, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I haven't heard from you in years. Why now?" "We've had some developments," Sarah said carefully. "There's been movement in the case." "What kind of movement?" Christopher pressed, sitting up straighter. "It's sensitive. We prefer to speak with you in person." "Sensitive?" Christopher repeated, his frustration mounting. "I've been waiting for answers for nearly a decade. Now you suddenly have news, and I'm supposed to wait longer?" "I understand," Sarah said, her voice softening, "but this is complex. We believe it might be tied to a larger investigation." Christopher's blood ran cold. Larger investigation? Could this be related to the man at his door? Or the mysterious arrival of the babies? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. "Fine," he said finally. "Tell me where and when." Sarah gave him the details for a meeting the following day, and as the call ended, Christopher felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had lived with Emma's disappearance for so long that it had become part of him, a scar he had learned to ignore. But now, it was being ripped open again. The rest of the day was a blur of tense anticipation. Christopher went through the motions of caring for the children, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed every conversation, every moment he had shared with Emma, searching for some missed detail, something that could explain why she had disappeared and why these children, his children, had appeared out of nowhere. That night, after the babies had finally settled down, Christopher sat by the window, watching the city's lights flicker far below. He couldn't sleep. His thoughts were consumed by the possibilities, by Emma. Could she really be alive? Had she been involved in something dangerous all those years ago? Something she had hidden from him? And more disturbingly, were these babies connected to her disappearance? The next morning, Christopher arrived at the address Sarah had given him. It was a nondescript government building, the kind of place most people wouldn't look twice at. He entered, trying to keep his nerves in check as he was escorted to a small conference room. Sarah Lane, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an air of authority, stood to greet him. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing for him to sit. Christopher sat across from her, his fingers drumming anxiously on the table. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice tight. Sarah slid a folder across the table. "We've recently uncovered information that suggests Emma Hart may still be alive." Christopher's breath caught. For years, he had dreamed of hearing those words, but now that they were spoken aloud, they didn't bring the relief he had imagined. Instead, they filled him with a sense of dread. "And?" he asked, afraid of what was coming next. "And we believe she was involved in something dangerous," Sarah continued. "There were financial transactions, offshore accounts, things that point to her being caught up in a conspiracy much larger than we initially thought." Christopher shook his head in disbelief. Emma wasn't like that. She wasn't involved in anything illegal. "We didn't think so either," Sarah said, but the evidence we've found suggests otherwise. And Mr. Wright? Christopher looked up, his heart in his throat. We believe the children might be part of this. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The children? His children? What are you saying? He demanded, his voice louder now. That she abandoned them because of some conspiracy? We don't know the full story yet, Sarah admitted, her gaze unwavering. But what we do know is that people have been looking for those children. Dangerous people. Christopher stood abruptly, his mind spinning. This is insane. Emma would never leave her children in danger. I know this is difficult, Sarah said gently, standing as well. But you need to understand, whatever Emma was involved in, it's not over. These people are still out there, and they're still searching. You need to be careful, Mr. Wright. Christopher's world tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about Emma, about their life together, was unraveling. And now, the 3 innocent lives he had taken in were part of a much larger, darker game than he had ever imagined. As he left the building, his thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, fear, disbelief, but most of all, a renewed determination to protect his children, whoever was after them, whatever Emma had been caught up in. He wasn't going to let them be pawns in someone else's game. He had lost Emma once. He wouldn't lose them, too. The air was thick with tension as Christopher drove back home from his meeting with Sarah Lane. The city blurred past him, but his mind was fixated on the bombshell she had dropped. Emma was alive. His heart and mind were at war. Relief mixed with anger, and confusion roiled within him. Why had she disappeared? What had she been involved in? And most importantly, why hadn't she come back for him? For their children? He barely remembered parking his car in the driveway. His thoughts were clouded, his emotions raw. As he approached the front door, he stopped short, his eyes locking on a black SUV idling at the curb. The same SUV he'd noticed parked near his house on and off for the past few days. His pulse quickened. He knew it was connected to everything that had happened. Christopher clenched his fists, ready to confront whoever was inside. But before he could make a move, the back door of the SUV swung open. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. A figure emerged, shrouded in shadows, and then stepped into the sunlight. His heart stopped. It was Emma. She looked different, worn down by the years, but there was no mistaking those eyes. Her gaze met his, and in that moment, it was as if the world fell away. Everything, the pain, the unanswered questions, the anger, faded into the background. All that mattered was that she was here, standing in front of him, after so many years of silence and uncertainty. Emma, he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Christopher, she replied, her voice trembling. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes welling up. I'm so sorry. I never meant to leave like that. Never meant to leave? He repeated, the shock giving way to a wave of anger. You vanished without a trace. Do you have any idea what that did to me? What I went through? Emma flinched as if struck. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I know, she whispered, and I'm sorry. I didn't have a choice. Christopher shook his head, unable to believe what he was hearing. Didn't have a choice? You left me. And now, his voice broke as he struggled to keep his composure. Now I have 3 children in my house who were abandoned on my doorstep. Our children. Emma's face crumpled. I know, she sobbed. I know they're ours. I thought they were safe. I thought. You thought they were safe? He interrupted, his voice rising. Emma, I've been raising them without knowing where they came from, without knowing if they'd be taken away at any moment. And now I find out you've been alive this whole time? It wasn't supposed to be like this, Emma pleaded, her voice desperate. I was trying to protect them, to protect you. From what? Christopher demanded, stepping closer, his heart pounding. From what, Emma? Emma glanced around nervously, her eyes darting to the SUV behind her. There are people after us, Christopher. Dangerous people. I didn't want you involved. I didn't want to put you at risk. Christopher stared at her, his mind struggling to keep up. It felt like he was being thrown into a movie plot, not his own life. You're not making any sense. What people? What happened to you? Emma took a deep breath, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "It's a long story, but you need to know that it started right before I disappeared. I was approached by some very dangerous people who believed I had something they wanted. Information. I didn't, but they wouldn't believe me. When I found out I was pregnant, I tried to run, but they caught up to me." She paused, her voice breaking. "They kept me prisoner for months, trying to force me to tell them what they wanted to know. I was terrified they'd hurt the babies. But then, one night, I escaped. I thought I'd finally be able to come back to you, to tell you everything. But they were watching me. They knew everything about us." Christopher felt his anger being replaced by a cold, hard fear. "And the babies? How did they end up on my doorstep?" Emma bit her lip, her voice trembling. "I had to leave them somewhere safe. Somewhere I knew they'd be cared for. But I couldn't stay. If I stayed, they would have found us. I thought if I left them with you, they'd be safe. I planned to come back when it was over, when I could finally protect them." Christopher's heart broke at the raw pain in her voice. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he was still so angry, so confused. "You should have trusted me," he said quietly. "You should have let me help you." "I know," she whispered, "but I was scared. I was so scared of losing you all." He took a deep breath, trying to process everything she had said. "And now? Why are you here now?" Emma took another step forward, her eyes pleading. "Because they're still looking for us. I found out they know about the children. That's why I had to come back. We have to get out of here, Christopher. We have to leave, or they'll take them." Christopher felt a surge of protectiveness flare up inside him. "No," he said firmly. "We're not running. I'm not running. These children have already been through enough. I'm going to fight for them." "But you don't understand," Emma began, her voice rising in panic. "No, you don't understand," Christopher cut her off. "I'm not going to let them grow up afraid. I'm not going to let them be taken. We'll figure this out, but I'm not abandoning everything." Emma looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. "You can't fight these people, Christopher. They're powerful. They have resources. They'll do anything to get what they want." "Then we'll find out what they want," he said resolutely, "and we'll stop them." For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. It was as if the years apart had dissolved, leaving them right back where they had started. Two people who loved each other but were caught in a storm they couldn't control. Then, slowly, Emma nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, but we have to be careful. We have to be smart about this." "We will be," Christopher promised, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together." For the first time in what felt like forever, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. But even as they made this silent pact, Christopher knew that this was just the beginning. There was so much more they didn't know. About the people chasing them, about the danger they were in. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. As they turned to head inside, Christopher felt a surge of determination. He would do whatever it took to keep his family safe, no matter the cost. The air inside the house was thick with tension as Christopher and Emma stood in the living room, their children sound asleep upstairs. It had been years since they had been this close, and yet the distance between them felt insurmountable. They had once been so deeply connected, but now there was a chasm filled with secrets and lost time. Christopher stared at Emma, his mind reeling from everything she had told him. It was like being thrust into a nightmare, where nothing made sense and the stakes were terrifyingly high. He could see the exhaustion etched into her features, the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She had been through hell, but the weight of her choices bore down on him like an anchor. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "Emma," he began, his voice steadier than he felt, "I need to know everything. No more half-truths, no more evasions. If we're going to protect our children, I need to know exactly what we're up against." Emma nodded, swallowing hard. She glanced at the staircase, as if expecting one of the babies to wake up at any moment. "I'll tell you everything," she said quietly, her voice laced with regret. "But it's a lot, Christopher, more than you can imagine." "Start from the beginning," he urged, sitting down on the couch and gesturing for her to do the same. "When did this all start? Who are these people?" She hesitated, then sat beside him, wringing her hands. It began before I knew I was pregnant. I was working on a research project for an NGO, something to do with humanitarian aid in conflict zones. We were gathering data on illegal arms trades, human trafficking, dangerous stuff. Christopher felt a chill run down his spine. He had known she was involved in important work back then, but he had never imagined it was anything this dangerous. And you got caught up in it? Emma nodded. There was a man, Miles Carpenter. He was funding several projects, and on the surface, he seemed legitimate. But I found out he was using the NGO as a front to cover up his involvement in illegal operations. When I tried to expose him, things got ugly. She paused, her eyes filling with memories that clearly haunted her. They came for me. They threatened me, and when they found out I was pregnant, they used it against me. They told me if I didn't cooperate, they'd make sure my children were never born. Christopher clenched his fists, anger boiling inside him. And you thought the only way to protect them was to leave me? To disappear? Tears spilled over as she nodded. I thought if I stayed, you'd all be in danger. They were watching us, Christopher. They knew everything. Where we lived, where you worked. I couldn't risk it. Then why not tell me? He demanded, his voice breaking. Why not let me help you? Because I didn't want you involved in this, she cried. I thought if I stayed away, they'd leave you alone. But then I realized I couldn't protect the children forever. I had to disappear completely, or they would have found me, and them. So you left the babies at my door, he said, his voice softening. You thought they'd be safer with me. Yes, she whispered, wiping her tears. But I didn't think they'd keep looking. I didn't realize how deep this went. It wasn't just about me exposing them. There's something else, something they think I have. Christopher shook his head, trying to comprehend. What could they possibly want from you now? Emma took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. They think I have evidence, something that could destroy them. I don't, but they're convinced. I've spent years hiding, running from place to place, trying to stay one step ahead. But it's never enough. Christopher leaned back, his mind spinning. This wasn't just about protecting his children from some random threat. This was about taking on an organization powerful enough to track them for years, ruthless enough to destroy anyone who got in their way. What do we do now? He asked, his voice heavy with the realization that their lives would never be the same again. We need to find out what they're looking for, Emma said, her voice gaining strength. If we can figure that out, maybe we can end this. But it's going to be dangerous, Christopher. I don't want you to get hurt. Christopher met her gaze, his determination unwavering. I'm not going to let you face this alone. Not anymore. For the first time in years, they shared a look of mutual understanding, a bond forged not just by love, but by the fierce need to protect their family. Whatever had happened in the past, whatever secrets still lurked in the shadows, they would face it together. The next morning, they began making plans. Christopher took a leave of absence from work, knowing that his full attention was needed to navigate the storm that was coming. They arranged for security measures around the house, surveillance cameras, reinforced locks, anything that could buy them a little more time, a little more peace. Emma combed through her old contacts, people she had once trusted, trying to gather any information she could about Miles Carpenter and his network. It was dangerous work, reaching out to people who might still be under surveillance, but they had no choice. One afternoon, while Christopher was sorting through some old case files in his office, Emma burst into the room, her face pale. I found something, she said breathlessly. A name, someone who used to work with Carpenter. He might know what they're after. Who? Christopher asked, his heart racing. James Bennett, she replied, handing him a piece of paper with an address scribbled on it. He was one of Carpenter's top aides, but he disappeared about a year ago. If we can find him, we might be able to get some answers. Christopher glanced at the address. It was in a small town upstate, far enough that it would take a day to get there and back. I'll go, he said, standing up. No, Emma said firmly. We'll go. Together. He looked at her, surprised. Are you sure? It could be dangerous. I know, she said, her voice steady. But I can't let you do this alone. I need to face this too. Christopher nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of fear and admiration. This was the Emma he remembered. The brave, determined woman who never backed down from a fight. And now, they were in this together. The drive to the address was tense, the silence between them filled with unspoken fears. As they pulled up to the small, run-down house, Christopher felt his stomach twist with apprehension. There was something off about the place, something that made his skin crawl. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, glancing at Emma. She nodded, her eyes locked on the house. "We need to know." They stepped out of the car and approached the door, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. Christopher knocked, his heart pounding in his chest. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open a crack, and a gaunt, middle-aged man peered out, his eyes darting nervously between them. "James Bennett?" Christopher asked. The man flinched, his gaze shifting to Emma. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by fear. No, you need to leave. Now." "Please," Emma pleaded. "We just need to talk. We're trying to stop them." James shook his head frantically. "You don't understand. If they find out I talked to you—" "They won't," Christopher assured him, stepping closer. "We're not here to expose you. We're trying to protect our children." James hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at them both. Then, slowly, he opened the door wider. "Come in. But you have to promise. You can't tell anyone I spoke to you." "We promise," Emma said, relief flooding her voice. As they stepped inside, Christopher felt the weight of what they were about to learn pressing down on him. Whatever James Bennett had to say, it would change everything. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to end this nightmare. The dim light inside James Bennett's house cast long shadows, giving the place an eerie, abandoned feel. Christopher and Emma stood in the cramped living room, their eyes locked on the man who might hold the key to everything they needed to know. James shifted nervously, glancing out the window as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. His thin frame was hunched, and his eyes darted around the room, never resting for long on any one thing. He had the look of a man haunted by his past. "You shouldn't have come here," James muttered, his voice shaky. "It's too dangerous. If they find out you've been talking to me—" "They won't find out," Christopher said firmly, though he felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at Emma, who gave him a small nod of reassurance. "We just need to understand what's happening. Why are they after us?" James let out a bitter laugh. "You really don't know, do you?" He looked at Emma, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. "They think you have something that could bring them down." "We know that much," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the fear she must have felt. "But I don't have anything. They're chasing a ghost." James shook his head, frustration etched into his features. "It's not just about what you have. It's about what you know, or what they think you know. You were working on something big, Emma. Carpenter's whole operation is built on layers of deceit, and you were getting too close to the truth." "What truth?" Christopher interjected, his patience wearing thin. "What are we missing here?" James took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to continue. "Carpenter's involved in more than just illegal trades. He's part of a network that controls everything, from politics to finance. They manipulate governments, start wars, control entire economies. And they've been doing it for decades." Christopher felt the ground shift beneath him. This was bigger than he had imagined. "And they think Emma has evidence of this?" "They think she knows where the evidence is," James corrected. "There's a ledger, a record of every transaction, every deal they've made. If it got out, it would destroy them. They've been hunting for it ever since they realized it was missing." "And they think I have it?" Emma asked, incredulous. "Why?" "Because the person who took it was close to you," James said quietly. "His name was Daniel Reed." Emma froze, her eyes widening in shock. "Daniel? He was?" "Your research partner," James finished. "And from what I've heard, your friend. Maybe more than that." Christopher's jaw tightened, a surge of jealousy and confusion flaring up inside him. He turned to Emma, his voice low. "Who was he, Emma?" She hesitated, her eyes downcast. "He was just a colleague. We worked together on the NGO projects. But I didn't know he was involved in any of this." James nodded. He kept it hidden from everyone. He was playing a dangerous game, trying to expose Carpenter while pretending to be part of his network. But he got caught. They killed him, and that's when they came after you. Emma's face went pale. Christopher could see the guilt and horror in her eyes, and he felt his anger dissipate, replaced by a cold dread. So, you think they believe Emma has the ledger because of her connection to Daniel? Yes, James said simply. And as long as they think that, they won't stop until they find it, or until they're sure she doesn't have it. Christopher felt a surge of protectiveness rise up inside him. And what about the children? Why do they care about them? James glanced at Emma again, his expression pained. Because they think the ledger might have been passed on to them, hidden somehow. They believe that if they get their hands on the kids, they can use them to get to you. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. I won't let them take my babies. I won't let them hurt them. They won't, Christopher vowed, his voice fierce. We'll protect them, Emma, no matter what. James looked at them both, his gaze filled with a strange mix of pity and respect. You don't understand how ruthless these people are. They won't stop until they get what they want. You're dealing with powerful enemies. If you really want to keep your family safe, you need to disappear. Go somewhere they'll never find you. We can't just run forever, Christopher shot back, his frustration boiling over. There has to be another way. There has to be something we can do. There is, James said slowly, his eyes darkening. But it's risky. If you could find the ledger before they do, you could use it as leverage. You could negotiate for your safety, for your children's safety. Christopher exchanged a glance with Emma. It was a long shot, a dangerous gamble that could backfire spectacularly. But what choice did they have? Where do we even start looking? Emma asked, her voice thick with fear and determination. James hesitated, then pulled out a small, battered notebook from his jacket pocket. He flipped through the pages, then handed it to Emma. This is the last known location Daniel was seen before he disappeared. It's a safe house in the city. If the ledger is anywhere, it's there. Emma took the notebook, her hands shaking. Thank you, James, she said softly. I know this wasn't easy for you. I just hope you find it before they do, James replied, his voice weary. And Emma, be careful. They're watching everything. Christopher nodded, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down on him. We will be. Thank you. They left James's house in silence, their minds buzzing with the information they had just learned. The drive back to the city felt surreal, the world outside the car window moving in a blur as they tried to process what lay ahead. Daniel, Emma murmured, almost to herself. I can't believe he's gone. I didn't even know he was involved in this. Christopher reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll get through this, Emma. We'll find the ledger, and we'll end this. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. I'm sorry, Christopher. I'm sorry for everything. For leaving you. For putting you and the children in danger. Don't, he said softly. We're in this together now. All that matters is keeping our family safe. When they finally arrived back at Christopher's townhouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the city. They entered the house, feeling the exhaustion of the day settling into their bones. The babies were still sleeping, oblivious to the danger that loomed over them. Christopher and Emma sat down at the kitchen table, the notebook between them. It felt like they were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to leap into the unknown. Are you sure about this? Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. If we go after the ledger, there's no turning back. We'll be putting ourselves right in their sights. Christopher met her gaze, his expression determined. We've been running and hiding for too long. This ends now. We find that ledger, and we take control of this situation. Emma nodded, her fear giving way to resolve. Then let's do it. They spent the rest of the night planning, going over every detail of what they would do. It was risky, and it was dangerous, but it was the only chance they had to protect their children and end the nightmare that had taken over their lives. As the city slept around them, Christopher and Emma prepared to face the storm head-on. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, and they would not back down. The city was still under the cover of night as Christopher and Emma pulled up in front of the nondescript building in downtown Manhattan. The safe house James had directed them to was hidden among rows of abandoned warehouses and vacant lots, a forgotten corner of the city that seemed to exist in its own shadowy world. They had been driving in silence, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. Christopher turned off the engine and glanced at Emma. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. He reached out, his hand finding hers, and squeezed gently. "We don't have to do this tonight," he said, his voice low. "We can take more time to plan, make sure it's safe." Emma shook her head, her grip tightening around his hand. "We don't have time, Christopher. The longer we wait, the closer they get. We need to find that ledger before they do." He nodded, swallowing his own fears. She was right. Every second they hesitated, they were putting their family in more danger. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and then opened the car door. The night air was crisp, the kind of cold that cut through even the thickest coat. They moved quickly, staying close to the shadows as they approached the building. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under their feet and the distant hum of the city that never truly slept. Emma pulled out the key James had given her, her hands trembling slightly as she fitted into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell that disappeared into darkness. Christopher went in first, his senses on high alert, every muscle in his body tense. The air inside was stale, and the dim lighting cast eerie shadows on the cracked walls. They moved cautiously, descending the stairs one slow step at a time. Each creak of the old wooden steps echoed through the silence, amplifying their fear. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, musty basement. The room was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, and there was a faint smell of mold and dust. Christopher scanned the space, his heart pounding. "Where do we start?" he whispered, turning to Emma. She pulled out the notebook James had given them, flipping through the pages. He said there was a hidden compartment somewhere, behind one of the walls. They moved methodically, checking the walls, tapping and listening for any hollow spots. Every minute felt like an hour, the tension growing with each unsuccessful attempt. Christopher's frustration was building when, finally, Emma's fingers brushed against a small indentation in the far corner of the room. "I think I found it," she whispered, her voice shaking. Christopher hurried over, watching as she pressed down on the hidden latch. With a soft click, a small section of the wall swung open, revealing a dark, narrow space. Emma reached inside, her breath hitching as she pulled out a metal box, its surface scratched and worn. "This must be it," she said, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. Christopher took the box from her, his hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. He fumbled with the latch, and after a moment, the lid popped open. Inside, nestled among some old papers, was a thin, leather-bound book. "The ledger," he breathed, pulling it out carefully. They both stared at it, the reality of what they had just found sinking in. This was it, the key to everything. The evidence that could finally expose Carpenter and his network, that could finally give them leverage to protect their family. But before they could process what this meant, a sound echoed from the stairwell above them, the unmistakable creak of a door opening. "Someone's here," Christopher whispered, his heart lurching. Emma's eyes widened in fear. "We need to hide." They scrambled, shoving the box back into the compartment and closing the wall just as the sound of footsteps echoed down the stairs. Christopher grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her behind a stack of old crates. They crouched there, trying to steady their breathing as the footsteps grew closer. Two men appeared at the bottom of the stairs, their shadows long and menacing in the dim light. They moved slowly, methodically, scanning the room. One of them pulled out a flashlight, the beam sweeping across the dusty floor and over the walls. Christopher's mind raced. If they found the ledger, everything would be lost. He glanced at Emma, her face pale and tense, and he felt a surge of protective instinct. He had to get them out of here. The men started moving towards the corner where they were hiding, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically. Christopher held his breath, his muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. Just as one of the men reached out to move the crates, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by a voice shouting angrily. The men froze, their heads snapping towards the stairwell. They exchanged a look, then turned and rushed back up the stairs, their footsteps fading quickly. Christopher let out a long, shaky breath, his body trembling with relief. He turned to Emma, who was clutching his arm, her eyes wide with fear and shock. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. She nodded, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "We need to get out of here. Now." They waited a moment longer, listening to the sounds above. When they were sure the men were gone, they moved quickly, slipping back up the stairs and out of the building. The night air was a shock to their senses, and they ran to the car, hearts pounding, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. As soon as they were safely inside, Christopher turned to Emma. "We have to assume they know we were here. We're not safe." "I know," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "But we have the ledger. That changes everything." He nodded, his mind racing. They had what they needed, but they were still in danger. Carpenter's people would come after them, and now it was a matter of time before they closed in. They needed to act fast. "We need to find a place to lay low," he said, starting the car. "Somewhere they won't think to look." "There's a safe house I used once," Emma said quickly. "It's outside the city, near the Catskills. It should be safe for now." Christopher nodded and pulled away from the curb, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The city lights faded behind them as they sped away, the sense of urgency and danger growing with every mile they put between themselves and the city. As they drove, Emma reached for his hand. He glanced at her, the fear and determination in her eyes reflecting his own. They were in this together, and there was no turning back now. "We'll make it through this," he said, squeezing her hand tightly. "We have to." She nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "We will. For the kids." The road stretched out before them, dark and winding, leading them into the unknown. The night was far from over, and the danger was closer than ever. But for the first time, Christopher felt a glimmer of hope. They had the ledger. They had a chance. And no matter what, he was going to keep his family safe. The drive to the safe house was tense and silent, the weight of the ledger pressing heavily on Christopher's mind. The narrow, winding roads through the Catskills seemed to stretch endlessly under the night sky. Emma sat beside him, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, scanning for any sign that they were being followed. They arrived at the secluded cabin just as dawn was breaking. It was a modest, weathered structure hidden among the dense trees, the kind of place that could be easily overlooked, a perfect hideout. Christopher pulled the car up close and cut the engine, the silence of the woods enveloping them. "This place is still safe, right?" he asked, his voice hushed, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace around them. "It should be," Emma replied, glancing around. "I haven't been here in years, but no one else knows about it. We should have some time." They stepped out of the car, the crisp morning air biting at their skin. Christopher retrieved the ledger from the back seat, its weight feeling almost oppressive in his hands. This small book held the power to change everything, but it also made them targets. They were carrying the key to a dangerous game, and their enemies would stop at nothing to take it from them. Emma unlocked the cabin door, and they stepped inside. The air was cool and still, the smell of aged wood and dust lingering. It was a simple, rustic space, barely more than a living room and a kitchen, with 2 small bedrooms off to the side. Christopher set the ledger on the old wooden table in the center of the room, his eyes never leaving it. "We need to go through this, page by page," he said, his voice tense. "We have to know what we're dealing with." Emma nodded, pulling up a chair beside him. "Let's do it." They spent the next few hours poring over the ledger, the sunlight slowly filtering through the small windows as the day wore on. Each page was filled with meticulously recorded transactions, names, dates, sums of money that made Christopher's head spin. It was a detailed record of every illicit deal Carpenter and his network had made over the past decade. "This is unbelievable," Christopher muttered, his eyes scanning the columns of figures. "It's all here. Arms deals, money laundering, political bribes. This could take down half the people in Washington." "But there's more," Emma said, her finger tracing a line on one of the pages. Look at this. She pointed to a series of initials and coded numbers. These are off-the-books accounts, black sites. And look at this one. Christopher leaned closer, his heart pounding as he recognized the address listed beside the code. It was his father's estate, the house where he had grown up, where his father had died years ago under mysterious circumstances. "This can't be right," he whispered, shaking his head. "My father, he was a businessman. He had nothing to do with any of this." Emma's eyes were filled with sympathy. "Christopher, you know as well as I do that carpenter's reach goes deep. Maybe your father was involved without you knowing, or maybe he found out something he shouldn't have." Christopher's mind reeled. He had idolized his father growing up, believing him to be a pillar of integrity and success. But after his death, there had been whispers, rumors that he had been involved in shady deals, that his business empire had darker roots. Christopher had never believed it, but now, faced with this evidence, he felt his world shifting beneath him. "I need to go there," he said suddenly, the decision forming in his mind before he could second-guess it. "I need to see for myself." Emma's hand gripped his arm, her eyes wide with concern. "Christopher, no. It's too dangerous. If Carpenter's people are watching the house, I have to know, Emma," he insisted, his voice firm. "If there's something there, something that can help us, I need to find it. This ledger is important, but it's not enough. We need more." She hesitated, her fear for him evident, but she saw the determination in his eyes and knew there was no stopping him. "Then I'm coming with you." "No," he said, his voice gentle but resolute. "You need to stay here with the ledger. If something happens to me, you need to keep it safe." "Christopher, I'll be careful," he promised, squeezing her hand. "I just need to see for myself. I won't be long." Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she nodded, releasing his hand. "Be safe," she whispered. He kissed her forehead, then turned and left the cabin, his heart heavy but his resolve unbreakable. As he drove towards his father's estate, his mind was a whirl of emotions: fear, anger, and a deep, aching sense of betrayal. If his father had been involved in this, if he had been part of Carpenter's network, it would shatter everything Christopher had believed about his family. The estate loomed on the horizon, a sprawling mansion set against the backdrop of rolling hills. It had once been a place of comfort and security, but now it felt cold and alien. Christopher parked the car a distance away and made his way to the side entrance, slipping through the gate like he had done countless times as a boy sneaking in past curfew. The house was empty, its silence oppressive. He moved through the grand hallways, memories of his childhood flooding back. The laughter, the family dinners, his father's booming voice as he recounted stories of business and success. But now those memories felt tainted, hollow. He headed straight for his father's study, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was just as he remembered it: dark wood paneling, shelves lined with leather-bound books, the heavy mahogany desk that had always seemed too large, too imposing. Christopher moved behind the desk, his fingers trembling as he searched for some hidden compartment, some clue that would confirm or dispel his worst fears. And then he found it: a small, inconspicuous switch under the edge of the desk. He pressed it, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden safe. Christopher's hands shook as he entered the code, his mind racing back to the combination his father had taught him as a child. For emergencies, Christopher, and only then. The safe clicked open, and Christopher pulled out a stack of documents. His breath caught as he scanned the pages. Bank statements, offshore accounts, records of meetings with people whose names he recognized from the ledger. It was all here, proof that his father had been deeply entwined with Carpenter's network. He sank into the chair, the papers falling from his hands. His father, the man he had looked up to, had been part of this nightmare. He had been part of the corruption, the deceit, and now that legacy had come crashing down on him and his family. The sound of a car pulling up outside snapped him out of his daze. He moved to the window, his heart pounding as he saw two black SUVs screech to a halt in the driveway. Men in dark suits poured out, their movements swift and purposeful. Christopher's mind raced. They had found him. He needed to get out, to get back to Emma and the children. He grabbed the documents, shoving them into his jacket, and turned towards the back exit. But as he reached the door, it burst open, and two men stepped inside, their guns drawn. "Mr. Wright," one of them said, his voice cold and mocking. "Going somewhere?" Christopher's pulse hammered in his ears. He forced himself to stay calm, his mind racing. He couldn't let them get the documents, couldn't let them know about the ledger. "I'm just here to get some old family papers," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. "I didn't know anyone was interested in my father's old house." The man smirked. "We know what you have, Mr. Wright. Hand over the documents, and maybe we won't have to make this difficult." Christopher's mind was a blur, calculating his chances. There were at least 5 men outside, more than he could handle. He had to stall, buy himself time. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said slowly, backing towards the desk. "These are just personal papers. You're welcome to take a look." The man's eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing across his face. "Nice try," he said, raising his gun. "But we're not here to play games. Hand them over now." Christopher's heart pounded. He was out of options. Then, in a flash of clarity, he made his decision. With a sudden, desperate movement, he threw the stack of papers into the air, scattering them across the room. The man cursed, his attention momentarily distracted. It was all Christopher needed. He dove for the desk, grabbing the heavy glass paperweight, and swung it at the man's head. The impact sent him crashing to the floor, his gun skittering across the polished wood. Christopher didn't wait. He sprinted for the back door, his lungs burning as he burst outside and tore through the garden. Shouts rang out behind him, the sound of footsteps pounding after him. He reached the tree line, his mind focused on one thought: getting back to Emma, getting back to his family. The documents were gone, but he had seen enough. He knew the truth now, knew what they were up against, and he would use that knowledge to protect his children, no matter the cost. He didn't stop running until he was deep into the woods, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body aching. The men's shouts faded behind him, and he slowed, his heart still pounding with fear and adrenaline. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed Emma's number. It rang twice, and then her voice came through, tight with worry. "Christopher, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he panted, relief flooding him at the sound of her voice. "But they found me. They know I was at the house. I'm coming back. We need to get out of here. Now." There was a pause, then Emma's voice, filled with resolve. "I'll be ready." He hung up, shoving the phone into his pocket. He turned, his eyes scanning the dark trees around him. He knew they would keep coming, that this was far from over. But now, he had something they didn't: knowledge and the determination to use it. As he made his way back through the woods, he felt a grim sense of purpose settle over him. He was done running, done hiding. He would protect his family, no matter what. And if Carpenter and his men wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The sun was setting by the time Christopher reached the cabin. His body ached from the mad dash through the woods, his mind reeling from the events at his father's estate. But there was no time to rest. As he approached the front door, he saw Emma waiting for him, the fear and determination etched into her face. "They'll be coming for us," he said, breathless as he stepped inside. "They know I was at the estate. We have to move now." Emma nodded, her eyes flashing with resolve. "The car's packed. The kids are ready." "But, Christopher, what happened? Did you find anything?" He hesitated, glancing at the sleeping children in the corner, the innocence of their small faces a stark contrast to the chaos threatening to engulf them. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low. "I found documents in a hidden safe." "It's worse than we thought, Emma. My father was involved in all of it. Carpenter, the ledger, everything. And they were using the estate as a base. They're on to us now." Emma's face paled, but she didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her hand on his arm. "Then we'll use that against them. We'll find a way to make it right. But first, we need to get somewhere safe." Christopher nodded, his mind racing. "We need to get to a place where we can make contact with someone outside their reach. We can use the information we have to negotiate, but we have to be smart." They moved quickly, gathering the last few essentials and double-checking that everything was packed. Christopher scooped up Oliver, who stirred and blinked sleepily, while Emma lifted Grace and balanced her on her hip. Little Oliver reached out and patted Christopher's cheek, his small hand warm and comforting. "It's going to be okay, buddy," Christopher whispered, his heart aching with the weight of what lay ahead. "We're going to keep you safe." They bundled the children into the car, strapping them securely into their seats. As Emma settled into the passenger seat, Christopher glanced around the clearing one last time. The woods were quiet, the shadows deepening as night fell, but he knew better than to trust that silence. As they pulled out onto the narrow road, Emma reached over and squeezed his hand. "Where are we going?" "There's a place I know," Christopher said, his mind running through their options. "A small town a few hours from here. We can lay low there, get in touch with someone I trust, but we need to stay off the main roads. If they're tracking us, we'll be careful," Emma interrupted, her voice steady. "We've come this far, Christopher. We can't give up now." He nodded, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Every passing car, every shadow in the road seemed like a potential threat. He kept his foot steady on the gas, his heart pounding as they navigated the winding roads through the mountains. For the first hour, the drive was tense but uneventful. The children dozed in their seats, oblivious to the danger surrounding them. Christopher and Emma barely spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. The road stretched out before them, a dark ribbon winding through the forest. But as they rounded a sharp curve, Christopher's heart lurched. Headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, a pair of them, gaining on them fast. "Emma," he said, his voice tight, "we've got company." Emma turned, her face going pale as she saw the vehicles closing in. "Do you think it's them?" "Who else would it be?" he muttered, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Hold on." He pressed down on the accelerator, the car surging forward as the trees blurred past them. The headlights behind them grew brighter, closer, until Christopher could make out the dark shapes of two SUVs. His pulse thundered in his ears. They were being hunted. "Christopher, they're getting closer." Emma's voice was sharp with fear. He glanced at her, then at the sleeping children in the back. He couldn't let them be caught. He had to protect them. His mind raced, searching for a way out, some kind of plan. "There's a side road up ahead," he said, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his insides. "We're going to have to take it and hope we lose them in the forest." Emma nodded, bracing herself. "Just do it." Christopher's eyes locked on the narrow turnoff coming up fast. He slowed just enough to make the sharp turn, the car skidding slightly on the gravel as they veered off the main road and plunged into the dense woods. The trees loomed close, the branches scraping against the sides of the car as they barreled down the rough track. The SUVs followed, their headlights bouncing and weaving through the trees. Christopher's heart pounded as he navigated the treacherous terrain, trying to keep control as the car jolted and swerved. "We're not going to lose them like this," he muttered, his mind racing. He spotted a narrow trail branching off to the left, almost hidden by the undergrowth. "Hold on." He wrenched the wheel, turning sharply onto the trail. The car bumped and jolted as they tore through the narrow passage, branches clawing at the windows. The headlights of their pursuers wavered, then disappeared behind a thick stand of trees. Did we lose them? Emma's voice was tight with hope and fear. "Maybe," Christopher said, his eyes darting between the trail ahead and the rearview mirror. "But I don't want to take any chances." He pushed on, the trail winding deeper into the woods. The road was barely visible now, more of a suggestion than an actual path. They slowed, the car crawling over rocks and roots, the forest closing in around them. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a small clearing. Christopher stopped the car, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. The only sound the ragged breaths of their children, still asleep in the back. "Now what?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide and frightened. "We wait," Christopher said, his voice grim. "Just for a little while, until we're sure they're gone. Then we'll move again." They sat in the dark, their nerves stretched taut, listening for any sound of pursuit. Minutes ticked by, each one an agonizing eternity. Christopher strained his ears, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the clearing. And then, faint but unmistakable, they heard it, the low growl of engines, creeping closer. "They're still looking for us," Emma whispered, panic lacing her voice. "We can't stay here." "I know," Christopher said, his mind racing. "We need to get out of the car. If they find it, they'll know we're nearby." They moved quickly, unbuckling the children and wrapping them in blankets to keep them warm. Oliver whimpered, his eyes opening sleepily, but Christopher hushed him softly, holding him close as they slipped out of the car and into the thick underbrush. "Over here," Christopher whispered, leading Emma and the children to a dense cluster of trees. They crouched down, huddling together as the sound of engines grew louder, closer. Christopher's heart pounded as the beams of headlights swept across the clearing, illuminating the car they had abandoned. He held his breath, willing himself to stay still as the SUVs rolled into the clearing. The men inside got out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they approached the car. Christopher watched, every muscle tensed, ready to spring into action if they were discovered. "They've abandoned the car," one of the men said, his voice carrying through the still night air. "Spread out. They can't have gone far." Christopher's mind raced. If they found them now, they were trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He tightened his grip on Oliver, his eyes flicking to Emma. She was holding Grace, her face pale but determined. He had to do something. He couldn't let them be caught. "I'll distract them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Get the kids and go. I'll meet you at the rendezvous point." "Christopher, no," Emma hissed, her eyes wide with fear. "You can't. I have to," he interrupted, his voice fierce. "I won't let them take you. Trust me." Before she could protest further, he pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to each of the children. His heart ached as he looked at them, so small and innocent, caught up in a nightmare they couldn't understand. "Stay safe," he whispered, then slipped away into the darkness. He moved quickly, keeping low, his footsteps silent on the forest floor. The men were spreading out, their flashlights bobbing through the trees as they searched. Christopher's heart pounded as he circled around behind them, his mind racing with desperation and resolve. He picked up a rock, his hand steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Taking a deep breath, he hurled it into the woods opposite where Emma and the children were hiding. The rock crashed through the underbrush, the noise echoing through the trees. "There!" one of the men shouted, his flashlight beam swinging around. "Over there." They moved towards the sound, their guns raised, their attention diverted. Christopher didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted back through the trees, his lungs burning, his heart pounding. He had to lead them away, had to buy Emma and the children time to escape. He ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit close behind him. Branches whipped at his face, the ground uneven and treacherous under his feet. He pushed on, his mind focused on one thing, keeping them safe. But he could hear them gaining on him, their footsteps pounding, their shouts growing louder. He was running out of options, out of time. And then, up ahead, he saw it, a narrow ravine, the ground dropping away into darkness. He skidded to a stop at the edge, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There was no way across, no way down without risking a deadly fall. He turned, his back to the edge, his heart hammering. The men burst through the trees, their guns raised, their faces twisted with anger. "End of the line, right?" one of them sneered, stepping forward. "Hand over what you've got, and maybe we'll let you live." Christopher's mind raced. He had nothing to give them, nothing except his life. He took a step back, his foot slipping on the loose gravel. He felt the ground give way beneath him, his balance teetering. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice ringing through the night. "I'll jump if I have to." The men hesitated, their eyes narrowing. Christopher's heart pounded, his mind racing. He couldn't let them take him, couldn't let them find Emma and the children. He took another step back, his body swaying on the edge. And then, suddenly, a voice rang out through the darkness. "Drop your weapons. Now." Christopher's heart leapt as figures emerged from the trees, their guns trained on the men surrounding him. It was the police, their uniforms stark against the shadows. The men froze, their eyes wide with shock. One of them turned to run, but an officer tackled him to the ground, his gun clattering away. The others raised their hands, their expressions defeated. Christopher felt his legs give way, his body collapsing to the ground. Relief washed over him, so overwhelming it left him dizzy. He looked up as the officers surrounded him, their faces a blur. "You're safe now," one of them said, his voice steady and calm. "It's over." Christopher shook his head, his heart still pounding. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's not over. They're still out there. My family, we know," the officer said gently. "We'll get them to safety. Just hold on." Christopher's vision blurred, the world spinning around him. He felt hands lifting him, carrying him away from the edge. He closed his eyes, the darkness swallowing him. But even as he slipped into unconsciousness, one thought burned bright in his mind. Emma and the children were still out there, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. The first thing Christopher felt as he regained consciousness was the steady beeping of a heart monitor and the smell of antiseptic. His body ached, every muscle protesting as he shifted on the stiff hospital bed. Blinking against the harsh light, he struggled to piece together where he was and how he had gotten there. The last thing he remembered was the ravine, the confrontation, and the police arriving just in time. Panic surged through him as he sat up, his head spinning. Emma, the kids, where were they? He looked around frantically until a familiar voice cut through his fear. "Christopher, take it easy." He turned to see Emma standing in the doorway, her eyes red-rimmed but relieved. She rushed to his side, taking his hand in hers. The weight of her touch, warm and solid, grounded him, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. "Emma," he breathed, his voice hoarse. "Are you okay? Are the kids?" "We're fine," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "The police found us. They took us somewhere safe. We've been waiting here for you to wake up." Relief washed over him like a wave, leaving him dizzy and weak. He squeezed her hand, his eyes closing as he fought back tears. "I thought I'd lost you. I thought." "We're okay," she whispered, her thumb brushing gently over his knuckles. "Thanks to you." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. "It wasn't just me," he said. "The police. They told us everything," she interrupted, her voice steady. "About how you risked everything to protect us. About how you led those men away. You saved us, Christopher." He shook his head, struggling to find the words. "I did what I had to. I couldn't let them take you." Emma leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "You didn't just save us. You gave us a chance to finally be free. They've arrested Carpenter and most of his network. It's over, Christopher. It's really over." The words felt surreal, too good to be true. "And the ledger?" he asked, his voice cautious. "What about the evidence?" "It's safe," she assured him. "The authorities have it. They're using it to bring down everyone involved. They're not going to stop until every last one of them is behind bars." He nodded slowly, the reality of it sinking in. For so long, they had been running, hiding, caught in a web of fear and uncertainty. But now, for the first time, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. "And the kids?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Are they okay?" "They're perfect," she said, her smile soft and radiant. "They've been asking for you. I told them you were a hero." His heart swelled with love and gratitude. "I'm no hero, Emma. I'm just glad we're all okay." "You are to me," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "To us." She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss that spoke of relief, love, and the promise of a future they had almost lost. When they finally pulled apart, Christopher felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "I love you," he said, the words spilling out, raw and honest. "I love you too," she replied, her voice breaking. "And I'm so sorry for everything I put you through." "Don't," he said quickly, shaking his head. "We're here now. That's all that matters." They held each other for a long moment, the world outside the hospital room fading away. Finally, Emma pulled back, a mischievous smile tugging at her lips. "There's someone here who's been dying to see you," she said, her eyes sparkling. She turned and gestured towards the door, and a nurse entered, pushing a small cart with 3 familiar faces peeking out from behind a sea of blankets. "Daddy!" Oliver's voice was loud and clear, his little arms reaching out towards Christopher. Christopher's heart felt like it might burst. He reached out, his hands shaking as he took Oliver in his arms, pulling him close. Grace and the other Oliver followed, all 3 of them squirming and giggling as they piled onto the bed, their tiny hands grabbing at his shirt, his hair, anything they could reach. "Hey, little ones," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I missed you so much." They babbled happily, their innocent joy a balm to his battered soul. He held them close, breathing in their warmth, their sweet, familiar scent. For so long, he had feared he would never get to do this again, that they would be taken from him. But now, here they were, safe and sound. He looked up at Emma, who was watching them with tears streaming down her cheeks, her smile radiant. "We're a family," she said softly. "Finally." Christopher nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, we are." They sat there, the 5 of them, wrapped in a cocoon of love and relief. The world outside was still chaotic, still uncertain, but here, in this small hospital room, they had found something unbreakable: hope. As they laughed and played, Christopher felt the darkness that had shadowed them for so long lifting, replaced by something bright and new. They had faced the worst and come through it, stronger and more united than ever. And as he looked at his family, Emma's eyes shining with love, the children's laughter filling the room, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The past was behind them, and the future, whatever it held, was theirs to build. Together.